We live in an ocean of social stigmas. We are bound by the ideas, prejudices, and limitations that have been presented to us as the living truth. And in a country as racially diverse as South Africa, this is heightened by our lived experiences. We are ingrained with ideas of how all the different social groups are like, whether accurate or not. But we aren't completely unrelenting. We leave just a little bit of grace for those who we deem to be the exception. Tracy D. O'Neill writes about the exceptional Black and describes them as one who's often articulate, always well-spoken, cultured, and able to move seemingly effortlessly in white business, political, and social structures. My name is Sechele, and I'm here to tell you that I too once succumbed to Black exceptionalism. And I know I'm not the only one. The myth of Black exceptionalism is one that myself and many other Black South Africans are prevalent to. And I call it a myth because it is rooted in the false idea that any Black person who is proximate to whiteness is worthier than the others. This notion maintains that any Black person who's educated, who speaks in a particular manner, and who carries themselves in a certain manner is the exception. It is rooted in colonial understandings of Black people, which generally maintain that Black people aren't as couth or civilized as any other racial group. And although many people won't express these sentiments in that many words, it is detectable in microaggressions and evident in how we are treated differently based on how favorable and palatable we are to society. Growing up, I was often told, "You are not like the other Black kids," by virtue of my assimilation to whiteness. And so from a very young age, I knew that in order to win the affections and the acceptance of my community, I had to outperform everyone. And so I did. I partook in every activity within my reach. I made sure that I was always a part of the academic elite, and I always tried to be on the right side of conflict, so not to fall under the stereotype of delinquency. And don't get me wrong, I don't resent the hard work that I put in to be and do great. I resent that I felt like I had no other choice. Otherwise, I would be considered to be one of them. Abraham Maslow is most famously known for his hierarchy of needs, where he presents a 5-tier model of human needs. Third on his model is love and belongingness needs. It is inherent to human nature that we seek to belong to the community that we're a part of. So it is natural for someone like myself, who grew up not looking like the people around them, to work really hard in order for them to feel like they belong, even if that hard work requires of them to compromise themselves and their cultures. And that is where the threat to cultural preservation lies. IGI Global defines cultural preservation as the act of using deliberate and well-designed methodologies to maintain cultural heritage from the past for the benefit of the present and future generations. This cannot be actioned without a sense of cultural pride and identity. But now I beg to ask the question, how does one maintain a sense of cultural pride and identity when you are encouraged to neglect, or at the very least undermine, your culture, just so that you can meet the metrics of whiteness? Enumale Agara writes in her blog about Black exceptionalism and states how it denies us the individuality and the full spectrum of humanity that is so readily afforded to the white population. Every time we speak or act, our words and actions are often interpreted to say something about the entire Black population, either by confirming dominant stereotypes or by diverging from them. And that is when we become tokenized. The token Black person is the non-threatening Black person who bears the burden of having to represent the entire Black population. They are also expected to communicate on behalf of all Black people. And as Agata stated, Black exceptionalism is dehumanizing. We become dancing puppets of a westernized society just so that we can earn our stripes. We move according to what is said to be superior, even if that requires of us to undermine our own intrinsic needs and ways. Professor Grace Kuno writes in her article, writing to stay, running shoes replaced with high heels, about Black exceptionalism, particularly in the context of Black women. She states that the constant scrutiny and shifting goalposts is tied to the growing need to outperform in order for us to be seen as equally qualified. Black women are known to have to work twice as hard only for us to make it half as far as everyone else. But this is where my problem lies. The fact that external ideas have been internalized in the Black community and have caused a rift between us. A rift that poses a threat to the preservation of our cultures. So now I beg to ask the question, how do we restore cultural preservation in historically disadvantaged communities? Spatial inequality in South Africa finds its prevalence in how our country is physically dispersed. There is a physical separation between most of the Black population and productive activity. This is the legacy of our racial inequality and segregation, which persists up until today. More than 20 years later, the territorial variations of infrastructure, opportunities, and quality of life is strikingly evident, and for most Black South Africans, extensive traveling is required in order for them to have access to what should be equally dispersed. It is in the interest of cultural preservation that most people needn't move out of the communities that they've cultivated in order for them to have access to a better life, but instead that these underfunded and neglected communities be upgraded and improved. Spatial equality is necessary to instill dignity in historically disadvantaged communities. Secondly, it is imperative that we enforce cultural pride in the Black community. Had younger beloved grown up in an environment that enforced cultural pride that is rooted in her Blackness, she would have maneuvered in predominantly white spaces without having to code switch, and with an unwavering pride in her identity as a Black woman. This is why the codification and concentration of African cultures and practices is required, so that it can instill a self-pride in our community, and therefore cultural preservation. And finally, the intentional decolonization of social practices and norms is required. This is necessary to ensure that our value is not entrenched in our proximity to whiteness, but that we are empowered even if we don't meet those standards. It is so that we don't flee from the idea of being like the others, because there wouldn't be any others. Ultimately, my plight against Black exceptionalism is in the interest of preserving our own cultures and values. It is so that we can exist freely without having to subdue our minds and ways. It is so that future Black South Africans won't have to exist in a limbo between exceptionalism and dehumanization. And it is so that we don't have to flee from ourselves and those who look like us, just so that we too can belong.